Hi there. Before we talk about today's book, it's the second anniversary of the death of our good friend Marcus Gwynne. And I just want to mention that and to hope that you share a few memories, a few thoughts of Marcus at this time. He was a terrific influence on everyone in our community. Now, the next interview with Paddy Phillips, which will cover NLP, neural-based training and so on, will make reference to the influence of Marcus and how much respect he was afforded in our community. So I look forward to that. We will then now go on to today's book. The book we're going to talk about, Empire of the Summer Moon by Sam Gwynne. I first heard about it on Joe Rogan's podcast when he was talking to Taylor Sheridan. Taylor Sheridan has written and produced some of my favorite movies and TV. For example, Sicario, Wind River, Yellowstone, 1923, The Mayor of Kingstown, and many, many others. And him and Joe got talking about the Comanche raids in Texas and mentioned this book. And Joe had actually previously interviewed Sam Gwynne, so I looked up that interview and listened to it with tremendous interest. I'll put a link to those interviews, and bought the book and was absolutely enthralled by it. It's a terrific history. I already had read a little bit about that kind of period in Lonesome Dove and its prequels, which were actually fiction but contained a lot of real life characters and events. So to read the true history was truly a delight. So the Plains Indians, and the author uses the then contemporary term Indians rather than the current term Native Americans, so we'll use what the book uses. The Plains Indians, several tribes, including the Kiowas, the Apaches, but most significantly the Comanche, operated in an area which is called the Comanche area, which was vast. A large part of what is now Texas, New Mexico, right into Oklahoma and Colorado. And for centuries, these tribes and many other tribes in that area were permanently at war with each other. They were a warrior society who lived by raiding and stealing and kidnapping. They then came up against the Spanish, the Mexicans, and later the European settlers, and just looked upon them as another source of goodies to rob, and almost a prey animal, and came into conflict with the European settlers who were pushing westward. Now, we can't really discuss these tribes, particularly the Comanche, without talking about the bestial torture and violence they inflicted. During their own intertribal wars, they had no quarter was given or asked, and to be taken prisoner was a truly horrific event. But the Comanche in particular made a culture out of torture. They reveled in it and were experts at it, and they would torture a victim for as long as they had, sometimes for many, many days before the unfortunate died. And they really, really delighted in inflicting severe and prolonged pain. So this was their normal way of fighting, and it horrified the Europeans, and it led to a lot of reprisal, a lot of people being killed out of hand on both sides, and massacres taking place on both sides as well. The captives were treated in various ways. Babies were often just killed straight away. Adult men were tortured extensively before being killed. Adult women likewise, but with gang rape by the Comanche thrown in, and sometimes they would be taken as slaves to a life of perpetual beatings, severe work and misery. And younger children were often kidnapped and adopted into the tribe, because the Comanche and some of the other plains tribes suffered from low birth rate due to their nomadic nature, and the pregnant women being on horseback, and there was a lot of miscarriages, so they wanted to keep the numbers up, and they weren't in any way worried about absorbing different tribes or different races. The secret to the prowess of the Plains Indians, and the book goes into great detail and fascinating detail on this, was the horse. Now, the horse is not indigenous to North America. It was imported by the Spanish, and the ponies they imported were a hardy breed that were used to desert conditions and could eat scrub and the typical vegetation found in arid areas. Whereas later on, when other European settlers arrived, they brought horses with them of a different stock, who were more used to lush grass and grains, and were no match for the agile and enduring ponies of the plains. They were very adept at locating and breaking and taming and using these horses. That when the Spanish left, they released thousands and thousands of horses into the wild, and these bred and multiplied, and there were vast herds of these mustangs, and the Plains Indians made good use of them, in particular the Comanche, and they became very, very adept. A couple of 100 years of horseback warfare and living on horseback, and they were masters of it. When I used to watch Western movies, and you would see the stunt riders who would be either the Indians or the cavalry, particularly the Indians, would be portrayed at being able to hang by the side of the horse and pick objects up off the ground, pick up wounded colleagues, and fire their bows from this position on the hanging from the neck of the horse. It was all true. The Apaches were adept at this, and more besides. They were absolute masters of it, so much so that a US Army colonel regarded them as being the finest light cavalry in the world. Besides that, they were masters of the environment. They grew up in the arid area, particularly a massive section north of Texas called the Llano Estacada, the State Plain, which is a desert, waterless, unmapped, featureless area. which the Comanche were at home in, and that's where it was very hard to track them and follow them up. The depredations of the Comanche against the encroaching settlers, so much so, particularly in Texas, that steps had to be taken, and bands of Texas Rangers were formed, which were ad hoc militias virtually, no real uniform or anything. Some had prior military experience, some none, but they would operate to either protect the isolated settlers or to retaliate, try to follow up after a raid, and seek to bring the miscreants to frontier justice. Most successful was Captain Jack Hayes, and he sort of had an instinct for this kind of warfare and had some outstanding success. A problem that the Westerners faced was the mismatch of weapons. Even though they had firearms, they were single shot weapons, both the rifles, muskets, and the pistols. Whereas the Comanche were very, very expert with the bow and could fire while the rifleman was trying to reload after his first shot. A Comanche could fire 20 arrows with accuracy while galloping. So it wasn't until Samuel Coate developed the repeating revolver that things changed. And the book goes into this in some fascinating detail. When Colt invented this breakthrough weapon in an era when everything else was single shot or a few double barreled, it was met with apathy. The military weren't interested in the least, and obviously the principles of military weapons procurement haven't really changed over the years, and none of the other official organizations wanted it, with the exception of the Texas Rangers, who embraced it with enthusiasm. However, wasn't enough to keep Colt's enterprise afloat, and he became bankrupt. And then he was later persuaded by the Texas Rangers to restart production, and one of the senior figures, Walker, made some suggestions how he could arrange finance and so on, and also some design features for an improved version of higher caliber, which became the Walker Colt. And then eventually, obviously, repeating rifles entered the scene, and things started to change a little bit more in the favor of the settlers and the Texas Rangers. The US Army really never, ever, with one exception, got a grip of the Comanche tactics. They were baffled by them, and they were constantly outwitted by the Comanche tactics and their ways of attacking, and also the ways of escaping, and the ways of counter-ambushing. So the Texas Rangers had a lot more success. So things proceeded like that, and the Texas Rangers were having a lot of success, but then fate intervened in the fate of the Civil War, which took attention away from fighting the Indians. So the Comanches and the other Plains tribes flourished again. Then, after things settled down a bit, everything resumed. Now, there's another massive strand to the story, and this concerns the Parker family. And there was a young girl, Cynthia Ann Parker, aged 9, who was kidnapped by the Comanche while members of her family were butchered and raped around her. And she was adopted by the tribe and brought up as a Comanche, to the point where she married a renowned chief and bore 3 children. When she was in her 30s, she was rescued by the settlers and returned to civilization. But she always yearned to return to the tribe, and she missed her two of her children. Her youngest infant, a little girl, was brought out with her, Prairie Flower, and but for the rest of her life she was sad and wanted to return. She was moved further and further away from the frontier area, from the plains area, so that it became impossible. However, the story doesn't end there, and that story, by the way, is loosely the basis for the famous movie The Searchers, starring John Wayne, which many regard as his best acting role. And it was a very dark story. Natalie Wood played the young girl. That was impressive enough to rate a movie, but then her son, Quanah, became a very prominent warrior within the tribe, and eventually became the last war chief of the Comanche. And he resisted and fought to the end, and resisted being the tribe being taken into reservations for as long as possible. Up against him was a cavalry officer called Ranald Mackenzie. Now, this chap had been in West Point at the same class as George Custer, and he initially had quite a good career success in the first set of Indian wars. Again, in the Civil War, he gained a lot of respect as a born leader, and he had a reputation of being strict but fair with the men and led from the front. And then he was given the 4th Cavalry and the task of subduing the Comanche, and he led long expeditions into the Llano, the arid plain, which nobody had ever really penetrated before to any extent, and was able to surprise numerous Apache encampments, capturing a lot of horses, killing a lot of warriors, capturing a lot of the women and the children. And he was having a lot of success, coupled with, on a larger scale, the US government's policy of starving the Plains Indians into oblivion by slaughtering their food source, the bison. And this has got to go down in history as one of the worst events in animal extinction from a man-made point of view ever. And literally millions of buffalo were slaughtered, not for the meat. The hides and pelts were taken. Buffalo tongue became a delicacy, but the meat was largely just left rotting on the prairie. So it was a deliberate starvation strategy, and it worked. So eventually the 4th Cavalry and the near extinction of the buffalo drove the Comanche into reservations. But Quanah then became a noted leader in the political scene. He wore Western dress, lived in a Western house, had a large family, was very, very generous to fellow Indians. He would allow to camp on his property and he fed them, and he negotiated treaties. He became a renowned speaker, attracted a lot of the whites to his presentations and enthralling them, and he became a very, very renowned and popular figure. Ranald Mackenzie, who was a very successful officer, faded into oblivion. He had a lot of problems, what we would now call PTSD, also physical problems, and he was suffering mentally. And he asked to be relieved of his command and placed on medical leave. And the Army Board refused this, and he ended up in an asylum and died in ignominy. Whereas Custer, his classmate, became very, very famous for being a failure, which a terrible turn of history. Anyway, the book is absolutely fascinating. I read it very, very quickly. It's a big book, but I literally couldn't put it down. I found it full of interesting information, stuff on the horses, stuff on Colt and the revolvers. Really pricked on my interest to a high degree. Fascinating people, hard people on both sides. Tales of terrible, terrible cruelty, massacres perpetrated by all sides. Got to say, you know, drunken soldiers massacring women and children of the Comanche and other tribes. A lot on the Comanche society, which was unique. It was based very much on the individual, and there were no real chiefs in the sense that they had them in the other tribes. There was just a guy would be charismatic and popular, and he'd say, hey, who wants to come with me and raid those settlers over there? And they'd, oh yeah, we'll come with you. But if you didn't want to go, there was no problem. Or if you wanted to go and raid somewhere else, there was no problem. It was all based on individual effort, and there were no priests. They were religious in as much as they thought there were various types of spirits everywhere. They did have religion, but they didn't need anyone to tell them how to pray or to be the kind of intermediary between them and the spirits. It was a strange society, and if it wasn't for the fact that they were so savage with captured prisoners and innocent people, then there would have been quite a bit to admire. Certainly as fighting warriors, even the women had a lot of prowess and could ride and shoot the bow and arrow just almost as well as the men. Fascinating, absolutely fascinating book, and I really do recommend it. And have a look at the podcasts as well. I think you found them just as interesting as I did.